Josh Green went on to pursue a number of degrees in history, anthropology, and music at St. Thomas University, the University of Alberta, and Memorial University of Newfoundland. After accepting a position with the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick 2 years ago, he put his PhD studies on hold to pursue his work as that institution's photograph archivist.
I started planning this and I thought it would just show some of the classics, but a lot of people in this room have seen the classics already, so I kind of went further afield, and I started with the idea that I would have it as an introduction to this to try to look really deep and find all the pre-Confederation photographs I could find of Fredericton and the area. So I thought that would only take me an hour or two, and it wouldn't. I'd find the gems, but then I got obsessed with it, and up until an hour or two ago, I was finding more that I was quite sure were pre-Confederation, so I'd shunt those ones in. So I'd say it's pre-1867 heavy. Yeah, so you'll see it was supposed to be kind of half and half, but we stay in the far past, like for most of it. So, and then we move on. So I'm going to leave this up for a minute. This is a really nice one. This is one of the images that just today I was working with a young colleague and found that it's much older than we thought it was. But we'll talk about it later. And we're going to look at it closer in more detail. So one of the things I'm doing in this little talk is going through and we'll look at a picture kind of full scale and then zoom in on portions of it so we can see a little better, which is good because then we'll be able to see some detail. So the era that we're talking about before Confederation is really the dawn of photography in New Brunswick. So each image, even if it looks kind of mundane at first, and some of them will for sure, is a rare window directly into life and scenery in British North America in our province of New Brunswick. So these images, which predate Canada, often contain minute details that are worthy of close study. So fortunately for us, this is made more possible now than ever because of all the scanning, the high quality scanning we're doing. And so myself and some colleagues are always experimenting and trying to push the limits of some of these 19th century technologies, and we found that it's really incredible. So in short, without boring you to death before we even start, some of the old formats that we work with every day at the archives, glass negatives and stuff, there is almost no upper limit to the resolution that they have. So what I mean is the amount of detail captured in some of our earliest photographs is far greater than the vast majority of 20th century photographs that were created. So, and what I think is always super fascinating about this is that the photographers who were taking these pictures in the 19th century probably didn't know or care that they were capturing the details that they were, because the vast majority of photographs that people looked at in the 19th century were what they call contact prints, so they're the same size as your negative. So if you have a negative, even a quite large one that's 5 by 7, when you make a picture from it, it's also 5 by 7. So unless you have high-powered magnification, which not everybody was playing with magnifying glasses when they're looking at a picture in the past, it's really hard to see the details. But with scanning, we can take that and look as far into the image as possible, and we can see unbelievably minute stuff. So we're going to look at that as we go through, and it's a lot of fun. Yeah, so they kind of had no idea often what they were capturing, and enlargement didn't really exist much in the 19th century, certainly in New Brunswick. So they might take your 5 by 7, and the photographer would have never have seen his own image larger than 5 by 7. It was really costly, and before electricity, enlargers, you could build them on a roof, and it wasn't something we did in New Brunswick very much, that's for sure. So go next slide, please. And we're going to hear that a lot.
This works.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So the best way to start this talk about early Fredericton photos, I think, is to show you a St. John photo. There's only one. There's only a single St. John photo, and it's terrible too. It's in bad shape. But I wanted to show it to you because I think as far as everything I've found and read and seen over the last several years, this really quite nasty looking thing is probably the oldest photo of New Brunswick that exists. So we have it in our collections at the archives. It's probably taken in about 1853. As you can see, it's a front view of what was called the Imperial Building in St. John. So this is 24 years before the Great Fire, which destroyed almost everything. So this is long, long before that. It's at 2 King Street today, and it's the Bank of Montreal building, if anyone knows where that is in St. John, the corner of King and Prince William Street. So, so this is actually, it's probably the earliest one because almost no one in New Brunswick was taking outdoor pictures on daguerreotypes. So daguerreotypes were the earliest type of photographs that were commercially viable. So they're really the first photographs ever, and they were invented in 1839. And they're on a copper plate with a silver kind of dusting over top of it. They're extremely fragile, but they're also extremely high quality. So modern testing in the last 10 and 20 years has shown, and even in the 1840s, they knew people who were really into it could see under magnification. They're talking about being able to see, delineate all the lines in the buildings in the distance and stuff. And so we know that's true, actually. So the first photographs ever were incredibly high quality. And so you can't really tell here. This is just a kind of a quick scan. And someday I think we could work up a really nice version of this. But it's about an 8x10, imagine this, a heavy 8x10 piece of copper. And it's underneath a piece of cover glass. All these types of chemical deterioration and stuff obscure the image, but we can see enough here that you can, I think we can all tell it's a building at the extreme left at least. And we do have other later pictures of it to see, that it looked quite good. But even this one is worth looking at just a few things just to show what I did was just crop out a few areas and zoomed in on them. It's a bit harder to see on this screen again, but the top one shows how even in this, one of the most tarnished images I've ever seen, on a computer screen you can zoom right in and see fine architectural details, including all of the not gargoyles, but I forget basically the faces and stuff, the tiny features that are carved in sandstone blocks. With very careful work, myself or someone else could probably make out a bunch of the text, which is tiny on here. There's actually text on the doors above the windows and stuff like that. And you can see some of the goods in there. It's hard to see, but...
Does the building survive today?
No, that building burned at no later than the 77 fire. Yeah, so, yeah, and it's a Bank of Montreal. It's quite a nice building today, but it's a lot more modern than this one is for sure. So, yeah, if we could go next, please. So, yeah, pre-Confederation photography in Fredericton. Next again, I guess, sorry. All right, so the first photographer in Fredericton is not this guy, but this is an unidentified daguerreotype. So we don't know who the man is, we don't know who the person who created this photo is, but this is the exact sort of photo that Fredericton's first picture takers would have made. So it's high resolution. Like I said, this is a little bit better example. So this object, you'll actually be able to see this guy in person. After our break, I brought him along, and this is our kind of learning collection that we bring out into the public, and people can see a few samples. And this fellow's in there, so you'll be able to see what this looks like in person versus what we can kind of do on the computer. And so the guy's face is probably, like half an inch or something like that. And it's quite good. It's fairly sharp. His cheeks are tinted pink, even after a lot of fading. And these are like incredibly sensitive. And so all conservators and everything would panic if you take it out of a case, because it's unlike any other type of photo. You could run your finger, if you have a rough finger, just lightly over it and it would take the image away forever. It's a fine like silver dust on top of it. So it's really never recommended to take them out, and it's quite something. So anyway, so the first photographers in Fredericton, probably from everything I've been able to find, weren't here before about 1845. So photography was invented in France in 1839. And good on New Brunswick, we actually had competition in the photography business less than 2 full years later. So there were competing studios who were bashing each other in the St. John newspapers in 1841, saying, I do a better job than this guy, my prices are lower. So we were actually, being a port city and everything, it was quite a happening place. 60 years before Canada started, we had a booming, well, not booming yet, but we had a competitive photography business. So Fredericton, they probably had some guys traveling early on, 1841, like the St. John fellows who learned from traveling American photographers. But the earliest people I found are about 1845, just a few years later. So I've written here that they're mostly, these early photographers to me, in my estimation, are kind of more of antiquarian interest. They didn't take outdoor photographs, so I'm much less interested in them. The vast majority of photographs that were taken before the mid to late 1850s, or even the 1860s in New Brunswick really, were all indoor studio portraits. And daguerreotypes, you can't write on them very easily. They're not like a piece of paper, they're on metal. So people rarely identified them. So what we have is a pile of our actual oldest photos. The first 15 years of photographs in this province basically are just like this guy. They're nice and they're interesting for, you could see their clothing and poses and things like that, but there's very little other types of information you can get from these early photographers. But this guy, just to put a spotlight on him for a second, the first photographer in Fredericton, he was born in England in 1788. He was a merchant and daguerreotypist. And about 1829, he arrived in Quebec City. But by 1842, he was taking out ads in Quebec City papers announcing he was taking photographic likenesses, they were called. And he had been, he said, instructed in the art by one of the first artists in New York. So interestingly, his name was Frederick Wise. Also mentioned that he offered individual or group portraits, and this was fascinating to me, landscapes, architectural views, and street scenes, etc. So this sort of thing was common in France, where the daguerreotypes came from. They were invented in Paris. But anywhere in the New World, outdoor photography in the daguerreotype era, which lasted into the mid-1850s, extremely rare. So this fellow, who was one of the first practitioners in Fredericton, was apparently at the top of his game, and he could take outdoor pictures at a time when it was really hard. But he doesn't seem to have done it here, or they didn't survive. So, plus people, once paper photographs came into play 20 or so years after daguerreotypes, I would imagine people here, even if they had a view of their farm or whatever on a daguerreotype, wouldn't care very much about it, because they're very, as you'll see, they're kind of hard to see, they are hard to handle, they'll break, and they're just not a very nice type of photo. So anyway, he in 1845 visited Fredericton, was active here for the late part of July, and he might have retired from the photography business shortly after, but I'm sure he made some money photographing some of the well-to-do residents in Fredericton. Oh, so yeah, they're very rarely identified and equally rarely attributed, so we don't know who they are, the subject, and we don't know who took them, the photographer. But this one here, this is kind of interesting. This is about 1 millimeter, I would say, on the bottom left-hand side of the plate. It says Scoville, and I got very excited when I saw this. But Scoville is just a manufacturer of daguerreotype plates. So there was an American company that manufactured them. But it was tiny, and I looked at it under magnification very carefully before I saw anything, and I thought maybe Mr. Scoville had taken the picture, but no, it wasn't him. He just made the plate. Next, please. Oh yes, so our first, the first photographer who took pictures outdoors, who took pictures of New Brunswick and not just New Brunswickers in Fredericton, was a guy called George Stacy. And George Stacy was actually a Mainer. He's from Maine. He seems to have done his first work in Fredericton, which is quite interesting. This ad's from 1857 in the headquarters. Some of you folks know the headquarters very well, I imagine. But his ad is amazing. Well, it's quite good. It has a lot of detail. Stacy's ambrotype and photographic rooms over Lamont's store. And he says right away, on hand, I have a lot of photographs of Christchurch Cathedral in Fredericton, daguerreotypes, paintings, etc. So I saw the story of Stacy. I found out about him. I'd heard of Stacy before I found him in Fredericton, because he actually went back to the States after he worked here for about a year. And he became a noted Civil War photographer. So George Stacy, if you Google him, he has all these lovely, well, not so lovely, very interesting shots of the Civil War. So 61 to 65, he traveled, and he went, I think, even into Virginia, and yeah, he took all these scenes of battlements and aftermath and so on. And so Stacy's photos are kind of interesting, collectible. Library of Congress has them. But he got to start here. He cut his teeth in Fredericton, taking pictures of our old buildings. So that's quite good. And he was a really talented photographer. And I'd never seen a Stacy photograph before this year. So it was pretty fun. And the Olive Branch, I think it was, well no, S.R. Miller's bookstore, anyway. A bookstore in Fredericton sold a number of his paintings, so in the or photographs, sorry. In the same issue, a bookstore is saying, oh, by the way, we have a number of these photographs for sale. The first time I'd seen photographs of Fredericton for sale, so again, everything points to Stacy being our first guy who took pictures of Fredericton. So yeah. I think we go next, probably. Next slide, thanks. Alrighty, so this one, Christchurch Cathedral. So I read about Stacy's photographs and about his photos of Christchurch Cathedral before I saw one. So the moment I saw this one and it was stamped Stacy very kindly, he sold them in the bookstore and it was quite easy to identify them like by his name. So anyways, the moment I saw it, I knew it was the oldest photo of Fredericton I'd ever seen because it was stamped by him. He left in 1857 and never came back. So I want to talk about this for a minute. First, the color of it is a bit weird. Old photos, like in 19th century especially, they weren't black and white. They weren't black and white like we think of like 1950s, 30s, 40s, etc. Photographs being black and white and gray, and that's it. Old photos in the 19th century, they were monochrome, but they actually came in a broad range of tones because photographers deliberately toned them with different chemicals for aesthetic and preservation purposes. So it's very rare, somewhat rare, to see a 19th century photo that's actually black and white. They were pink and blue, brown, gold, and stuff like that. So they're beautiful in person. They have a kind of a different look than you'd imagine. Anyway, the important thing, this was taken by George Stacy. He's active in Fredericton from at least the 3rd December 1856 to about 30th of October in 1857. One of the first to advertise the sale of outdoor photos in New Brunswick. In outdoor photography, he may only be predated by a guy called Thomas Ellison in St. John, who is probably the guy who took that daguerreotype because he was always bragging about his ability to take outdoor pictures. So, and Ellison advertised in 1855, 2 years before this in St. John. He said he was the first person ever to print photos of St. John on paper. So, Stacy was from Maine, worked here, etc. And he took a few shots here 4 years before the start of the Civil War. So 6 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, you know, and all those other things that we think of as happening a long time ago, Stacy was here taking some nice pictures. This is one of the 2 oldest photos of Fredericton, period, I'm fairly confident. So, and they're both Stacy. So a few little details we can see here. I think if we advance one, I might zoom in. Yeah. The trees are just little staked in kind of little saplings around the front of it. And it looks like there might be, it's very hard to tell here, but there's some kind of little garden there or something. It's really, yeah. So if you study it carefully, you can see it's old. Yeah, and there's quite a nice fence all the way around. If we go to the next one again, yeah. Now it's, again, hard to tell in here, but a higher resolution monitor. This is a beautifully preserved photograph, and it was extremely well executed. You can see every line in the architecture of the building. It's a perfect record of the building in 1857. Under magnification, you can see anything you'd need to reconstruct the parts of the building that are visible should something happen to it or you need to do fine restoration. So anyway, next please. Oh yes. And then this is one you probably couldn't see in the other one. Over and above to the left of it, probably Walnut Church in the background. So this is also the oldest photo of Walnut Church as well. So, and there's a few other, there's many details. And when you get to the oldest photo, every single building is interesting because it may be the only photo of that building and the rate things were burning back then, it probably was the only photo. So, yeah. Okay, next, please. Oh yes, and then I think this is the last one. This is all from the cathedral photo. And this is the far right hand of it. I want to show there's just a little walkway, and you can't tell, but it's quite an ornate little fence that they have here, wooden fence, and some homes there in the background. Next, please. All right, so here's the other second, the 2 oldest photos of Fredericton. One is of the cathedral. One is, of course, of Old Government House, which at that time might still have been referred to as New Government House, but we'll talk about that later. So yeah, it's these are albumen prints. It was a standard print type of photograph in the 19th century. It's made from egg whites and silver salts that are suspended in it. So there were whole factories where they were cracking eggs and getting rid of the yellow and the yolk, and anyway, to make photos. Anyway, so this is quite a nice one. This is among the very oldest existing photos of New Brunswick, and one of only a handful of surviving photos of the province that's positively dated to the 1850s. You could count on less than 2 hands, certainly between our Provincial Archives of New Brunswick and the New Brunswick Museum, which are the 2, I think, largest repositories of historic photos. Probably on 2 hands, the photos taken in that decade outside, and this is one of them, so that's kind of interesting. We'll return to this image later when we talk a bit more about photos and depictions of Old Government House, because that's where we are. So that make us, and I'll make a little kind of visual history of the building for the first 50 or so years that it was around. So it's about, this building is about 190 years old now. We're coming up on its 200th birthday, so predates Canada by about 40 years. So. And we're going to look at some details of this photo, which are quite fun, I think, if we go next here. So this time, a fellow called, he's got a lot of names, John Henry Thomas Manners Sutton. So a number of us have heard Manners Sutton. There's a parish of Manners Sutton and many other things. So one of these fellows, probably the gentleman right here with this large top hat, probably Manners Sutton. He would have been in residence here at that time. So this is 1857. There's a chance it's 56, but I think it's probably 57. So if we look here, they're out front posing. I won't go on too much about him. He was from a long line of British conservatives. That shouldn't surprise anyone. Yes, the most interesting thing that I know about him is that he apparently chose to ignore a resolution passed in Canada in 1858, urging talks about the union of British North America, North American colonies to create Canada. So in part because he predicted that the maritime provinces might resent their loss of autonomy. Imagine that. And he was in favor of a maritime union, of Union of Maritime Provinces, however, and in 1858 reported to London that talks on that subject would begin shortly between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So we thought that maybe we could form a country, but the rest of them were on their own, so that's kind of interesting. And there's a little, this is really hard to tell on here, but I swear it's 3 children kind of sitting and poking out the window. And he had 4 sons and 2 daughters, I think. So he had the older ones out front with him, it looks like, and probably the children in the windows. Go next, I think, please. So a question that we get every 3 or 4 months of the archives randomly is, hey, what was in the alcove in the Old Government House? Someone here might know, but I've never seen any depiction ever or any mention ever of what was in it. And this is the oldest photo of it, and it's still empty. So it might be just an architectural feature. I don't know. There's one more lady peeking out a window, but she's not with anybody else, and she's up in the background. So she could be a family member or maybe a servant or something, a live-in servant, so which is pretty common. Oh yeah, and we'll keep looking at this photo because there's other fun details in it. If we could go next, please. These guys here, quite fancy. But what I like is this guy here. I had a colleague, a retired archivist, came by, if you can imagine, and we were looking at this together, and he didn't care about anything else except for this guy, who is about half a centimeter maybe on the print or something. So we were huddled over looking with magnifying glasses. So this fellow over here, he's got quite a long, this is a pretty decent shot of it, quite a long pike or lance with him. So probably, yeah, it's probably the only photograph we have of these sorts of antiquated military men. It looks like he might have been one of there might have been a dragoon possibly. So it's another. Sorry, what was I going to say about this guy? Yes. Anyway, I think I have. Maybe if we go ahead one more, we can compare. Yeah. So on the left image, yeah, from the Royal Collection, showing an 1855 photo of the 17th Light Dragoons Lancers in England. And they're, the hats are different and things like that, but their lances are quite similar, I think. So this photo on the left was acquired by Queen Victoria, photo on the right acquired by Provincial Archives in New Brunswick. So yes, so those guys are quite interesting. And there was one guard posted at either end of Old Government House, and both in the same kind of gear with the same tall lance. I think if we go to the next one. Yes, so Fredericton's first, so Stacy was here for a year and then he left. So I don't know if one would consider, a purist might say the early daguerreotypists who were all itinerant and only traveled in town for several months before leaving. They might call them the first photographers, or you might call Stacy the first photographer. He was here for a full year. He took pictures of the town before anybody else did. But a lot of people would think of George Taylor probably as our first photographer. We can at least say he's our first resident photographer. So George is in the top left in this picture, standing next to one of his daughters. He's the little fellow. I guess he was only 5 foot. I don't know. He's very slight anyway, 135 pounds. He was born in Fredericton in 1838, a year before the invention of photography, to Francis Marie and William Taylor. His dad was a carpenter who built their family home at 232 Northumberland Street, and that still stands today. Has a nice plaque on it. The family portrait here is with a painted backdrop, probably outside that home. George might have begun taking pictures as early as 1859 with a fellow called David Lawrence, because early advertisements for this David Lawrence guy, many people have repeated the information over the years that he started with David Lawrence. I haven't found a smoking gun for that, but George was taking pictures very shortly after, and David Lawrence, another itinerant photographer, advertised in his earliest advertisements in our papers, 1858 and 9, that he was David Lawrence and Co. And then all of a sudden he wasn't David Lawrence and Co. And then all of a sudden George Taylor opens a studio and David Lawrence leaves. And so, it's part of there's a bit of oral history about George, but a lot of the pieces seem to fit together quite well. So, he might have. So George's earliest photos are dated from at least 1862. So we can say that quite safely, that he was definitely doing outdoor photography at that time. When you're talking about the indoor photos that he may have taken, they could have been earlier, but it's pretty much impossible to tell unless we know who the person was. He opened a studio on Queen Street at least as early as 1864. And a large collection, we have, the Provincial Archives in New Brunswick has over 900 Taylor images. Most of them are negatives, which is important because we couldn't get the detail that we are going to look at in many of these photos, and we wouldn't have anything like the window into the 19th century without the negatives that we do. So if we didn't have them, we'd have prints which have only a fraction of the detail, resolution, quality of the negatives. So the negatives we'll see there's quite a lot of detail in them. So aside from his negatives, there's a large collection of Taylor's paintings at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in Fredericton. They usually have a few on rotation. There's 2 or 3 on right now. Some sketches and paintings are also held of his. are also held at the Provincial Archives. 4 of his oil paintings hang in this building. I don't know what floor they're on, but yeah, so there's 4 of them here. So we could go next, please. Just another family portrait. So without George Taylor, they did change their pose a bit. And there's a dog lying on the ground, which you can't see right here. He's not too much in view, but anyway.
Yeah, you get to see him right there.
There's always a dog in 19th century photos. You'll see later on, one of the most prominent, important, famous photographs that we have has an old dog laying in the front of it. So I don't know why, they were everywhere. So without George Taylor, the section that was supposed to be a short section on pre-Confederation photography in Fredericton would have ended with those first 2 pictures, essentially. It would have been pretty much done. We don't have much else for pre-1867 stuff, except for George. George was very active pre-1867, we'll find out. So for 40 years, more than 40 years, he traveled around the entire province and documented life in the pre- and post-Confederation days. He was almost always accompanied by hired First Nations guides, especially the Wolastoqey Maliseet, who knew the rivers very well. And George was hired by government, businessmen, the city, like municipalities, industrialists like Gibson, Alexander Gibson, everyone hired him. So we're finding more and more evidence all the time. He was in demand all through his life, basically. And even though it was the whole family, extended family, lived in that home in 232 Northumberland for many decades, 3 generations. He was never wealthy, but he seemed pretty passionate, and he was enough in demand to make a living. So if we could go to the next one, please. Oh yeah, so as evidence of that, this is a note many people have seen, copied in different places. It's a note from Arthur Hamilton Gordon, the Lieutenant Governor. He and George Taylor seemed to become friends, or at least close associates, from the amount of photographs that he took of Gordon, who lived in this building, of course. So we'll talk more about this shortly, but basically, I don't know if we can make out the note very well from where you are. The bearer, Mr. Taylor, has been requested by me to take photographic views of various places in the province. I shall feel obliged to all those who afford him facilities for the prosecution of the labors he has undertaken. And I wrote, these labors were considerable, because we'll find out right now if we advance one. Because of the type of photography that he was using. It's called wet plate photography, and it's because the plates, the negatives, had to be wet when you took them. So what that meant was you started with a bare piece of glass, like one of these window panes. you cut and broke it to the size that would fit into your negative holder in your camera. And then in the dark, this is a portable dark room taken from George's backyard, this picture. It's a crop of a picture. Anyway, you had to, in the dark, pour dangerous, toxic, flammable, syrupy chemical onto glass, drain it off, which was to make it light sensitive. Drain it off. There's many steps I'm skipping, but essentially do this entirely in the dark with your hands inside of a bag or a tent or whatever in the middle of the woods. And you had to have access to running water. You had to have all your chemicals with you. You had to have your heavy tripod. The camera weighed 30, 40 pounds with the tripod. The amount of material filled a canoe and it was heavily laden. And you had to have something like this. This is the portable one. So you would have had a dark room at home that was a big one. And this is, you'll see, not inconsiderable, so quite large. So anyway, he had to carry all this stuff around. The canoe on the left is laden with some of these goods, photographic equipment on an early expedition. So he went all around the province doing this. Basically, the image on the left, by the way, I should say, throughout the talk, there's lots of York Sunbury Historical Society images mixed in. The one on the left is one of York Sunbury's. So yes, everything, if we go to the next one, please. Yeah, we can see this. This is new clearing. We don't exactly know where, but probably above Edmundston based on the context of this appears in this album. It's quite rough, but, well, the landscape is quite rough. You can see crouching here is a guy with a giant camera right there. He could pretty much fit inside of that. So that, and this photo was taken probably not later than, well, certainly not later than 1871. So this is the sort of stuff that he was working with, basically. So they had to be sensitized in the field. You had your bottles of chemicals, your portable darkroom. You had to take the picture and then develop the picture. Well, actually, yeah, you had to fix it. So you had to, your plate was literally wet, dripping with chemicals. You put it in a light-proof box, put that box in your camera, lined everything up, took your picture, which could have an exposure. You physically removed the lens cap, and depending on how bright it was outside and how cold it was and all these other things, how windy it was, anywhere from a few seconds to 30 seconds to a minute if it was bad. And if you were lucky, you'd get a picture at the end of it. So you had to do all this stuff to take a photo, and it was quite hard to do. So we're glad that he did it though. But they produced very nice pictures. So if we could go to the next one. This is a classic. Lots of people have seen this one. Phoenix Square, so roughly in front of modern day City Hall. I believe so-called, or many people say so-called, because of the impressive number of fires and reconstructions which took place. So it was kind of a sarcastic name. Frederictonians gave, everything burned down here every 5 to 10 years. We'll find out shortly. It was really incredible. So this is this picture, George Taylor, shown here sometime between 1861 and 1866. So we're going to study some of the details in this photo. And as we're popping around, let's keep in mind that this negative, this image is roughly 6 by 8 inches. So what we're going to see comes from 6 by 8 inch negative. So if we'll go next, please. Oh, sorry, we'll back up one first. I'll give you a little overview. Looking, don't just forget you saw that. Now looking just across Queen Street to the square in front of City Hall, we see Temperance Hall, which is one of my favorite buildings here, shown on the right-hand side, with Hooper's Flower Store visible in the window below. The whole building was destroyed by fire in 1867. This will be a pattern, we'll see. Arthur G. Gunter's grocery store is visible on a sign. Yes, the Gunters, yeah. It's visible on a sign across from Temperance Hall. Now, we're going to zoom in on this in a second, but if you see, even in this photo, you can see the crowd of men outside of Temperance Hall. Yeah, so Hooper's occupation, who is advertising as a flower store, right here, this we'll see, he's advertising as a flower store, but his occupation, according to the tax assessment, what he told the tax man well into the 1860s was he was running a tavern. So he was actually selling liquor. Only post 1865 was he listed as a merchant, so possibly a flower seller. So to reiterate, bizarrely, and this is one of my favorite things that dawned on me in this whole project, the Temperance Hall, many of you are familiar with temperance, but the temperance movement was a social, religious movement to ban or limit the consumption of alcohol. It was a teetotaling. So anyway, they met in this building called the Temperance Hall to advocate the evils, against drink and the evils of alcohol. And the next door, or just below them, was a guy who was making a good living for at least 5 or 6 years selling liquor at the same time. So conveniently, one had the option either to turn to or away from drink all in the same place. So you could, or you could drink until you regretted it and then maybe go to a temperance meeting. So.
What's the perspective? Are we in the south here looking north, or in the north looking south?
So beyond this is the river. We're looking north. I don't know what that is, but towards Douglas.
Now City Hall.
City Hall, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the buildings there were many buildings quite similar, and we'll see some of them, that were burned and reconstructed over the 19th century until 1875 when we got our current City Hall, and they all stood roughly there, and they were roughly all big boxes. So, but we'll check some of them out. So if we go to the next one, this is this is Hooper's Flower Store, yeah. And this is great. So the small lettering, which is relatively visible here, legible, you can read it. Maybe you can read it there. It partly says cheap groceries, entrance front. So the text on this, the text portion measures less than 1/4 of a millimeter. So it was hard to get an accurate measurement on it. So 0.25 millimeters is the size of this text, which is, it doesn't look like text. It looks like a tiny smudge or human hair on the negative, basically. So on the original. And then with some scanning and playing around with it, we can read it fairly clearly. So we can see that he was allegedly a flower seller at that time. But if we could go to the next one, please. So we're going to pan around this image, the 1860s here. We'll see who are these guys? Oh yes, Gunter, yeah. And if we go to the next one, this is the crowd out front of the temperance/liquor emporium there. Temperance Hall sat on roughly the grounds of City Hall. Yes, yes, again, I've gone over that. Sorry, one more. Okay, then we have John Greaves' cheap store, and we have I like to think, a man and his wife looking to see if they'd like to go inside. So, right there and there. So it's an early dollar store, yeah, and they're right in the city center, obviously. So, well, shilling store at that time, I guess. So, if we go to the next, and there's some people hanging out. Yep, we'll go there. That's perfect right there. So, right here we see a heavily loaded hay wagon, and the market in Phoenix Square in front of City Hall was, for as far as photographs and lithographs go back, was a hay market, and people brought their hay. Wintertime, massive loads of hay line up all through the 19th century to sell hay at the market there. So one of my favorite details about this, you've got some kids, street toughs hanging out over here, a little guy here. You can see right inside the building. And it says, I think, photograph rooms. It's partly bent or whatever. So what's fun about that is that banner, as per in the Fredericton Business Directory from 1862, there was a J.R. Barker who worked as a daguerreotype, ambrotype photograph artist out of Phoenix Square, and this possibly was his studio. So on the top floor to let lots of light come in, probably. So yeah, that's that. If we could go next, we'll keep on going. That's our liquor guys again, or temperance, whoever. Oh, I think we're going the right way. All right, yes, great. Yeah, okay. So that first image that we saw on the title page, this is a tiny crop and zoom in from that. And this is one that I just found out today was actually a pre-Confederation image that I had long thought was just after, about 1871. But having looked at the Temperance Hall for so long, I knew what it looked like. So this is the Temperance Hall. It's not the building that came in after the Temperance Hall. And the Temperance Hall burned in 1867. So this is a shot from St. Mary's Shore looking over towards downtown. This is a tiny crop section of it. What do we got here? On the left, the old military hospital, taken down, I forget the date, but not later than 1875 because of the normal school, somewhere right around there. Anyway, it was knocked down so they could put up the normal school.
Is that a ferry?
Yeah, I think that might be a ferry there. I couldn't tell if it's a little steamer or ferry, but it could be a ferry. And the ferry landing was certainly right up, and they came right up there alongside City Hall, Temperance Hall. So the Temperance Hall / Hooper's Liquor and Flower Store burned in 1867, and that's that right there. So we know this picture is no later than that. So that's kind of interesting. If we could go to the next one, please. These are, yes, looking up Queen Street towards Regent Street. from a position kind of roughly in front of City Hall. Looking down it, we're going to zoom in on different portions of these images as well. And this is 1862 to 1864, so at a minimum 3 years before Confederation. This is a stereographic image. So there's a left hand and a right hand, and they're actually two different views. So if you stick them together, you can see that this right here is kind of the edge of that. So you get the left hand looking in the square, and then the right hand looking down the street. And even in this one, which is zoomed out, you can see the Wilmot church spire, which most of you will know, but some may not have heard, for many, 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 many years had the gigantic finger pointing up into the sky like this, a giant wooden finger. And you can almost distinguish it there, but it was clearly visible when you zoom in. So if we go to the next one. So on the corner, yes. So we can see meat hanging outside a shack in Phoenix Square on the corner of what would become the Justice Building / normal school property, 1862 to 64. There's carcasses here. You can see men milling around doing business inside. If we go to the next one, this is all from the same left-hand image first. The old military hospital that we saw from across the river is still there, and it was gone 10, 15 years after this photo was taken. There's not many photos of this, certainly. Yeah, demolished no later than 1875 for sure. So we go to the next one. Some other crops from around, showing the slow speed of photography, especially in the winter and on overcast day. People are milling around, they're just ghosts. So the people who didn't pose for photographs, especially in the 1860s and 70s, if you see people who are clear in a photograph, they knew that their photograph was being taken. And sometimes we would have, in New Brunswick and elsewhere, entire squares that knew that their photograph was being taken because it was an important thing. So everyone was standing, reading their paper, or with their hand on their horse. And 90% of the time, in really clear old photos, when people are clear, they're leaning on something. And that's not just incidental, it's so that they can steady themselves for a few seconds, because if you move an inch, it doesn't look very good. It looks like this. And of course, we have just visible down there, there's a little bit of hay, a big stack of hay, the horse market, and then over in the distance, I think is Christchurch there. So if we go to the next one, cropping around, looking around the other one. Left, Wilmot's finger, on Wilmot Spire, and some of the businesses here, which I hadn't looked at until the other day, visible along Queen Street, south side of Queen Street. A.B. Holyoke, who is a watch maker and jeweler, watch and jewelry store. Coulter's Dry Goods on Queen, and Anderson. It looks like Anderson, but it's hard to read, but there's certainly the City Bakery, which is farther down. It's not visible on this, but it is on another screen with high resolution, so it's a City Bakery here. There's a ton of business names that could be researched on this one, but if we go to the next one. Looking down Queen Street in the upriver direction, so towards York Street, about 1862. We can see William Jarvis's boot and shoe store, the Olive Branch bookstore, Tattersall the tailor, Lamont and Son Furniture and Glassware. The Lamonts were in business for so long that many of you know them. And the relatively poor quality of this one's due to it being a photo of a photo. So George has hundreds, probably over 150 photos that are just reproductions of older photos, and the quality goes down greatly, but there was no other way in the 19th century to copy pictures. There are no photocopies or anything like that. So, of course, if we go to the next one, this is the corner of Queen and York Street in about 1865, showing from left to right. At the extreme left, Thomas Pepper's shack, then the old military hospital, and Andre LaForest Tinsmith shop, which is right here. We're going to look at some of these details. In the distance at the right, soldiers' barracks, of course. So this is where the normal school would go, and these buildings would be taken down to erect the normal school on that property. And the normal school eventually became today's Justice Building that we all know there. So if we could go to the next one. So again, looking here, this is LaForest Tinsmith shop. This is kind of interesting. This is an Acadian man, Andre Napoleon LaForest. By 1865, he was listed as a tinsmith at Phoenix Square in the assessment list, but his shop probably stood in the same corner until as late as about 1875 when it was taken down for normal school. A neighboring building sign reading Peppers that I mentioned earlier. There's a Thomas Peppers listed as an Irish trader in the 1865 tax assessment list. So I want to thank Cora Livornia for her newspaper clipping that adds a funny bit of color to this from 1870s. It contextualizes this photo and this guy in part because it reads, "Such a noble pile of buildings," talking about the new justice building, normal school is going to come in. "Such a noble pile of buildings will certainly be a great ornament to the city and immensely improve the appearance of the grounds as they now present themselves to public view. The hospital is to be taken down, and the best part, as well as the smaller buildings within the prescribed space, and Mr. LaForest will be obliged to remove his tin shop," which we see there, "which has been an eyesore to the city ever since it was erected. His lease expires in December, but we've been informed that it can be terminated at a month's notice." So they wanted them out. And it doesn't look like an eyesore to me at all. It's quite a nice little building. Thomas Pepper's shack down the road is a shack, though. Yeah, so if we go to the next one, to break our pre-Confederation timeline for a second. Oh, yes, I want to mention the posters all over the place. Advertisement, real problem. Oh, if we go to the next one, sorry. Yeah, the posters are constant blight, and people complained about them in the newspapers all the time. And they were hideous. So anytime people put up a sign in downtown Fredericton, it was pasted with bill posters everywhere. So one visible one here advertises a sewing machine, so nothing too exciting. But if we go to the
fence that we're looking at going down the street?
Yes, yeah, tall wooden fence along that edge of the military property there. Yeah, if we go to the next one. Right. So yeah, to break our timeline for a minute, what I like about this is LaForest was treated fairly cruelly and kicked out. I don't know if what he was paid or whatever, but he was publicly humiliated in the newspaper. But poor Mr. LaForest was probably ejected by winter time, but not to worry, he was in business again almost immediately on the other side of the square. So we can see in 1877, shortly after the construction of the current City Hall, if we zoom in there, that's a crop from there. That says A. LaForest. He just moved his tin to the other side of the street. So, yeah, his eyesore was moved across the square, basically. Different building, but same business. So, yeah, if we go to the next one. Oh, yes, this is good. So this one here, this is a 5x7 negative, sorry. And this was when I was doing some early testing with high resolution. What we see here, obviously, there's the arrows point, these are extreme kind of close-up crops from the window and the board out front of City Hall. So the board, which is barely even distinguishable as a board or anything other than a fleck, the little speck on the negative, you can read most of that. Even from on this screen, you can probably read some of it. I don't know if you can, city clerks, first door left, and so on, like that. So you can read everyone who was there. It's just incredible. We're talking about minute, like the size of barely a fingernail. And in the bottom window, the Peppers were still in business. James Pepper, it says something like fish and poultry, canned fish and meat, and we can see anyway. So the bottom was used as a market in the building, and we can, things invisible at the actual size are legible. So anyway, so in Melinda and Coral, I can just let me know when, because I'm just going to keep on trucking for a while, unless someone objects. So just wave. Okay, if we could continue to the next one. That photo was 1870, so it was too new for my interest. So we'll go back to the actual old photos, the pre-Confederation ones. So this is officers in camp at the old racecourse, 1865, and I think we have.
What would be the exposure time for that?
It really depended so much on how overcast it was, but it could be just a few seconds. It could be as short as 6 seconds, 3 to 6. Because the horses, some of them are cooperating fairly well, blurry head, but some of them are able to control their animals fairly well for a few seconds. So, which I can't imagine how you would do that, but 3 or 4 seconds. Okay, so yes, this likely shows militia officers as opposed to British regular army garrison men. As a lieutenant governor at the time, Arthur Hamilton Gordon was a major booster of the militia. So the Fenian Scare and their attempted raid of Campobello Island the following year provided a lot of impetus for Gordon's attempt to whip militia into shape in New Brunswick, which was not ragtag, but it could have been better. So if we go to the next one, I think it's a zoom. Here we go. Arthur Hamilton Gordon, Lieutenant Governor, we're in his home now, his former home, in militia officer's uniform, 1865. So he's there, and half or more of the shots we have of Gordon, he's in a military uniform. So he was a major boost.
These are taken on what is now the exhibition ground?
No.
Well, yeah, I mean,
No,
it's the old race course, which is actually. Sorry, go ahead.
farther downriver.
Hmm.
With the,
John could say too, John Hildebrand. The old race course is not exactly where the current exhibition grounds is,
The
but
race course between York Street and Smythe Street, York and Northumberland, really.
right. So we'll see all that big open space we see.
old exhibition halls and that area too.
Right, yes, exactly. And I think we're going to get a look at that too. So, yep. And if we could, 2 days ago I had a close look and determined this was probably Arthur Hamilton Gordon after having looked at him for so long over and over and over. But so that's why we see a picture of him here today. If we go one more. This photo was very bright. The negative is very bright. So I was playing with it, the settings, and messing around a bit. And it was too bright, and there was nothing interesting in the skyline, so I couldn't show my skyline interested friends much until we went to, if we go to the next one, I darken it up, and a church appears in the background. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know what this one is, but someone in this room probably does. So we'll chat about that, I imagine.
Probably St. Dunstan.
Okay, yeah. So, and it's not a bad likeness or whatever, so anyway, that popped into view. The people's faces become too dark, but there you go. So if we go to the next one, nothing at all. It's very boring. Maybe the next one after that.
The picture didn't populate.
Oh, okay, there we go. Yep, so formal parade of garrison Imperial soldiers on the old 1 mile racetrack that we were just talking about, June 1865. What looks like a regimental band, or at least a band in nice uniforms on the left, soldiers and onlookers, a huge crowd there. So if we go a little further with these guys, so this was long identified as the 22nd Cheshire Regiment, so until I was working on this, who were the last regiment to be garrisoned in Fredericton. They left shortly after Confederation in 1869. So British soldiers used to go on tour to many parts of the colonies, for people who don't know, and Fredericton was just another stop for them, and a tour when they were garrisoned here 3 or 4 years, and then they switched off in St. John and new guys came in. So these guys were just on rotation in Fredericton. So that's the 22nd Regiment I'm talking about. So this was long identified as these fellows. However, their uniforms and hats don't look much like other 22nd Regiment gear, and some sources say the 22nd only occupied Fredericton from 66 to 69, and this shot really seems like 1865 based on the other photographs we have in this series, but we can talk about that for interested people later. So if we zoom again, oh yes, one back, sorry. I want to point out the fairly severe emulsion cracking. So all these, the actual image containing particles, the material on the negative, cracked at some point, and many of these are in really kind of scary conditions, so we don't like to mess with them too much, because just like a daguerreotype, if this stuff flakes off, like if you breathe too heavily on a lot of these, they'll flake off and they're gone forever, or if they go under your chair or whatever. So we have to be super careful with them, and that's why scanning them once at a super high resolution is kind of one of the nicest conservation strategies and the finest way that we have to study them easily too. So this just gives a little insight into that. Yeah. And I can't get enough of these guys. The 22nd Cheshire Regiment in Officers Square, 1866 to 69, they're in there. And if we zoom in on these guys a little bit, I'm sure someone here should know. What's the attached wooden building on the left? I don't know. Oh, okay. Mary Quarters. Okay. Barrack store, then, okay. We'll fight it out. So on the left, we see ladies with parasols looking on from the balcony of what is now our lovely museum. And below and to the right, we see youngsters hanging out of a window in the wooden building that used to be attached to it, where it's just a parking lot. Yeah.
There was one woman was living in the Mary quarters, and her husband died, and she had to move out right away.
Right. Oh, yeah, I imagine so. If we could go to the next one then. Yes. So most of George's photos and all of his interesting ones, the ones that I like, are outdoor photographs. But he seemed to hang around with Gordon a lot and with the men of the 22nd. There's at least 10 or 12 photos of the 22nd, the men of the 22nd in there. So some very fine studio portraits of them. These guys are unidentified. Careful study of these well-executed portraits would reveal fine details of uniforms at that time. And studio portraiture was a stable, if relatively uninteresting staple for Taylor, who was already an experienced outdoor landscape photographer by this time. So it was a way to pay the bills, and that's why most people did stay in their studios. It was quite stable. People came through and got pictures for occasions and then ordered copies, and you made your bread and butter that way. So if we could go to the next one. Definitely militiamen. We'll see in a second. I think drilling on the old racecourse, possibly in 1865. So the variety of uniforms in this photo and many other things point to it probably being militia as opposed to British regular, who are very nicely uniformed and had the same equipment. Each man looked like they were part of an army. So they're prepared to assist in a cavalry attack in this picture. The position front rank kneeled on the right knee, placing the butt of the rifle on the ground, and the rifle held up at an angle. And the rear rank stands with charge bayonets position. So we'll see if we zoom in on these guys a little bit. It's quite interesting. You can see them all having quite a nice time there. Some of them just relaxing in front of the crowd. And if we go to the next, there's a lot of nice skyline stuff that we'll look at some other day. And here, drilling on the racecourse. Some lads look quite young. I don't know if you can tell here, but this guy, there's almost no way that some of them are over 14 or 15, but you know. Note the scaffolding on the church spire in the distant right, which I think is Christchurch Cathedral. We'll see a clearer shot. There's a couple shots in the 1860s with the scaffolding. I don't know what they were doing to the spire in the 1860s, but someone may know, and we can find out not too difficultly. So if we go to the next one, where are we at? Militia on the right, British men on the left, drilling an old racecourse, 1865. Large crowd assembled, lots of skyline there. If we go along further, again, here's what I mentioned. Christchurch Cathedral steeple undergoing renovations or repair or something, 1860s. That's kind of neat. If we go a little further, militiamen drilling an old racecourse, 1865. I think we've got the idea about these guys. Keep on. Oh, sorry. Where are we now? Yeah, a fine and rare view of Fredericton skyline from the back edge of town is visible, and we can see many features that would give us an unusual, rarely seen angle on the back end of Fredericton in the 1860s. So careful study could find a lot of buildings that were probably not well photographed or documented. So if we go to the next one, 63, 64, Fredericton Rifle Company in front of York County Courthouse on the far left. So the York County Courthouse, finally a building that still exists. That one's around, and we all know it's Isaac's Way today. So that's Isaac's Way on the far left, and the Fredericton Rifle Company in front of them. So they were allegedly marched to St. Andrews during the Fenian Scare, and they never saw any action, but they had to go all the way there over the roads on foot. So that didn't sound very fun in the springtime. So if we go to the next one, zoom in on these boys here in front of the York County Courthouse. And we'll go one further. And yeah, this is basically the extreme left building, which is partly cropped out. You can see Isaac's Way today there in 2016, what it looked like. So that's kind of interesting. If we go one more. So this one, we all know these guys. The construction of Fredericton's first exhibition building, Palace. Many people have seen this. 1863-64, corner of Westmore and Saunders Streets. George Taylor probably could have seen it from his backyard, it looks like, and took a number of photos documenting its construction. So once complete, this building was arguably one of New Brunswick's most impressive. It stood only from 1864 to 1877, when it burned after a fire spread mysteriously from a nearby shed. So everything burned, and especially the nice things burned. They burned really quickly in New Brunswick. So if we go to the next one here, you can see it in construction. This is a zoom in on that workmen high up on the scaffolding. You can see them if we zoom in and see everybody up there doing the really elaborate woodwork around the windows and stuff. If we go one further, And this is what it looked like when it was done. Many people have seen this photo, but I thought it'd be fun to show the construction and the completed project. Yeah, and this photo, I don't know when it was taken, but between the completion and 1877. There's no other details really much visible, so it's lovely though. And yeah, so a fitting way to end the discussion of pre-Confederation photos. This depicts the Fredericton delegates going to the Charlottetown Conference that resulted in the Federation of the Provinces. Probably taken late 1864 aboard the steamer Anna Augusta. Although we had no reason to doubt the information that had come along with this photo for the last 50 years, necessarily, it seemed relatively unverifiable. And the opposite shoreline looked quite unfamiliar to me if they were indeed leaving from Fredericton. However, recent research by John Hildebrand suggests a fairly good possibility that this indeed shows the very early 1860s Devon-Gibson shoreline across the river. North side, Fredericton, the folks who don't know Devon, lending more credence to the idea that this original description is accurate. So it could indeed be the gentleman on the way from Fredericton to Charlottetown, PEI, to discuss the creation of Canada, so leaving. So if we go back, or go ahead another one. Oh yeah, there was a uniform band on board, it looks like. There's a big bass drum down here laying down, suggesting some significance of the departure of this alleged Charlottetown Conference steamer. So yeah. So Confederation photography. Do we have time to talk about that, or I don't know? No?
It's speeding up a little bit there. We're getting to be about, I mean, I don't know how everybody feels, but it's about 8:35 now, so
Yep.
another 5-10 minutes, is that all right with everybody?
Whatever anyone can tolerate. That's yeah. So yeah, we spent all the time in the distant past. So we'll look at just a few things quickly. We'll go back into newly minted Canada and Fredericton as it's joined the Union of Provinces. We don't spend much time in individuals and studios because most are unidentified and kind of boring. This is an exception. This tintype is one of very, very few early studio shots of black people, a black person in New Brunswick. So from the slide, you know, this is probably 1870s studio portrait of a black woman identified, another rarity in old photography, as Sophie Hart or Sophia Hart. And it was taken by Mr. Moores on Queen Street. There is a Sophia Hart who's identified as the widow of James Hart, living at the corner of King and Carleton, and her husband might have been killed by a falling log, but there's no time to talk about that. But here she is. It's a very lovely portrait. So if we move to the next one. This is the building that came after the Temperance Hall, the liquor store / Temperance Hall. So this city hall, having been built to replace the Temperance Hall, which burned in 1867, had the misfortune of only being around for about 7 years before it also burned. And other things around it burned, and just everything was burning in Phoenix Square all the time. So what's interesting though, this kind of rarely seen or little known shot, this high resolution scans that could be pulled from this remain kind of the best visual record we have of fleeting bits of architecture like this, which was quite an impressive building, but most people haven't seen or heard of it because it burned so quickly. So if we go to the next one, zoom in the fellows out front and keep on trucking here. Yes, this is a great one. Photo information identification courtesy of my friend John Hildebrand, who's always looking at George Taylor photographs. He's a tireless photo history sleuth and researcher, so thanks very much. This, we didn't know what this was until John took a really good look at it. It's probably Boss Gibson's tannery at the corner of the Nash Walk and St. John Rivers in the 1870s. It's a beautiful shot. There's wood boats and tanners at work. Wood boats were the boats that up and down St. John River that delivered loads of wood sold to people. Tanners at work, Barker's Point's visible in the distance, making this one of the most interesting early photographs of Barker's Point, which is my neighborhood. So this is one of the best photos that there is. The clouds are painted in because negatives at that time were super sensitive to blue light. So your sky would just be totally blown out white, and they would manually paint in clouds after it. So it's not a bad job actually. It's all hand done. And Morrison's Mill, which is roughly down where the yacht club is in the distance too. So if we zoom in on this, we'll see a few things. John picked all this stuff out. The tanners at work, amazing shot of the guys with their leather, the hide stretched out, drying in the sun, all these racks of leather, folks hanging out the windows, tough characters. So we go, keep on trucking through here. These are the wood boats kind of docked or whatever, anchored at the mouth of the Nashwauk River, and Barker's Point in the distance, and Morrison Mills over here, and some more skin laying on the ground. Next one. Yeah, this we can end here shortly. I promise. This is the schooner Jenny Gibson, moored alongside a long, low pier, roughly in the area of Carlton Park in the 1890s, just upriver from the walking bridge, basically. So this is pretty interesting because it offers a rare insight into shipbuilding in Fredericton. We have very, very few images, like a handful of images that talk about, that show our shipbuilding past in this city, and this is one of them. So there's a very nice write-up on the back of this in an unknown hand that reads, "The schooner Jenny Gibson was one of the schooners built by the late Alex Gibson at the mouth of the Nashwauk during the last years of the 19th century. It was lost at sea with all on board." So, and what was interesting about this is the color is quite washed out on this, but it's a print by George Taylor that he made from one of his negatives, and then he hand painted all the color in the river and the sky and the cathedral and the men, the little flag on the boat and everything like that. It's pretty tastefully done. So anyway, and I think we'll just kind of quickly cruise through a couple here. That's, again, this is a lovely shot, 1890s, over into the north side, showing Nashwauk River. If we go one further, ship's moored here, and one further again, zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. This is a ship under construction. This is probably the best picture we have. This is from like a 4x6 little tiny card picture that we have, and you zoom way into this is, you know, like a half an inch or something, quarter of an inch, and there's this massive sailing ship under construction here, and you can see it's all kind of, the ribs are done and they're filling in the boards there, so it's quite nice. And it's probably Boss Gibson building it right at the mouth of Nashwauk there. So if we go further, click through them here, and that's John Taylor, it's George's brother. He was an inventor. These are some of his inventions coming up rapid fire. If you go one further, this is an early hand pump for putting out fires that he built. He won many awards from the 1860s onwards for his ingenuity and cash prizes and much accolade, but he never married or had any children or anything. If we go further, this is him standing outside his workshop in the 1870s, Northumberland Street. We go again. That's him, again, with his whetstone, and this is the material he had to work with to build the objects you'll see in a second. He had the foundries in the city as well. You'll see he needed those to build. If you go next, his paddle steamer, which is probably his crowning achievement. 4 or 5 people could sit in it. It was specially designed to go around the small islands north of Fredericton. I'm pretty sure that this is Curry Mountain here. This is up looking at Douglas. And I think one of our archivists lives right over there somewhere. But anyway, this is really impressive. He designed and built this and had the metal parts made at the foundry, and he was apparently quite a whiz. So we'll go a little further. He built Fredericton's first bicycle. That's him on that, testing it out in his yard. And then we'll look at the one more here. 20 years after that photo was taken, bicycles were very popular in Fredericton, and they were an important tool or vehicle of female liberation and independence. Basically, they allowed ladies to move around quite easily through public space. And I have to read this. I don't know, maybe I should end with this one. But of bicycles, the famous suffragette, women's rights activist, anti-slavery activist Susan B. Anthony said about bicycles. I don't know if we can see this here. Let me tell you what I think about bicycling. This is in the 1890s. I think it's done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel. She said that in 1896. So yeah, and then, so yeah, it's a young lady and their bicycle in Queen Square in 1897. So, anyway. Yeah, I think I should probably stop. There are other things to say, but.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. You know, I think that we could have Josh Green Part 2 to this. I'm serious, because apparently he has an entire cache of photographs of Old Government House.
Yeah, they're in there.
And I mean, we could spend another hour here this evening, or if everybody's up to it, but I think we may consider having you back for another part 2 and talking about Old Government House or the other photos that we didn't get a chance to see here tonight, because I think there's a great interest. And certainly by the turnout this evening, we're very pleased to see that you're all here tonight to listen to Josh's talk, and also to show that enthusiasm for, you know, local people who do this research, these people who become subject matter experts in an area of history that one might think is rather, you know, remote and not relevant, but in fact it is so relevant, isn't it all? We're all engaged in this tonight, looking at those photographs, and we see the places, and it rings, it resonates in our experience, because we know those places, and now when we look at those places, we're going to say, I saw that picture, like Isaac Way, or where the Temperance Hall was, you know, that burned down, and those fellows standing outside. I wonder if they were looking for a drink or they were protesting the Temperance Hall.
It's hard to say.
So I'd like to thank you, Josh, and I have a small gift for you. And on behalf of the Fredericton Region Museum, York Sunbury Historical Society, I'd like to give you a copy of our Officers Quarterly. And every member of the society, if any of you are interested in joining the York Sunbury Historical Society, Fredericton Region Museum, we would love to have you join us. And this is one of the benefits of being a member, is you get twice a year the Officers Quarterly, which is filled with amazing, interesting, fascinating stories about central New Brunswick and mainly Fredericton's history. So if any of you are interested in joining us, we would love to have you come. We're open every day, Monday to Friday. Well, Monday I'm there, but we're not supposed to be open to the public. But if you bang the door, I might let you in. We're open every day from 8:30 to 4, and open to the public for tours between 1 and 4 till the end of November. We're opening up again in April. So please, Josh, accept this small gift, and there's a little Tim Hortons card there for you too.
Holy
if you like
smokes.
Tim's.